Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Harshmeet Singh and I welcome you all to this extremely important series of lectures. In this series of lectures, we will be covering Economics NCERTs of class 11th and class 12th. As you know, NCERTs are by far the most important and credible source of preparation for the UPSC CSE aspirants. Especially when it comes to subjects such as economics, NCERTs hold even more significance. And that is why during this entire series, we will be taking chapter wise analysis of all the chapters of class 11th, and then we will move on to class 12th. In class 12th specifically, there are two books of economics, one that focuses on microeconomics and the other that focuses on macroeconomics. We will be covering all these, so make sure that you watch each and every chapter because it contains a lot of details and there is a past track record to suggest that direct questions in the prelims and in the mains examinations can ask from what we read in the NCERTs. One other interesting aspect, especially of class 11th NCERTs, is that a lot of content is quite common with what you have actually read in other subjects. For example, in chapter 1 that we will be discussing today, you will notice a lot of things in chapter 1 are those that you usually do read in modern history as well. So, just in case you are thinking to yourself, that seems more like history, less like economics, please do stay tuned because this is extremely important. And if it is a bit common with other subjects, it's even better for you because it is helping you to revise in not just one but two subjects here. So let's begin without any further ado with the first chapter that we have. So class 11th first chapter focuses on where India stood at the time of our independence. 15th August 1947, that is when the British decided to leave India. That is the time that India was not in a great condition economically. Almost every single development parameter that you can think of, literacy rate, mortality rate, average income, all those things were at an extremely dismal level. This chapter dives deep into where India stood at the time of our independence. How did the British leave us? What were the exact numbers? What was the data at that point of time? And you can compare that to where we stand now, just to see the kind of progress that has been made over all these decades. You all know that major part of the world at one point of time was under the control of the British Empire. However, amongst all of them, India held an extremely special place. That is why India was called as a ground jewel of the British Empire. And it's not just an account that Indians talk about. If you look at the historical accounts of the British officers of that time themselves, they themselves gave a very special place to India. This, for example, is a statement that you see from the former Secretary of State of the Colonies of UK, where he famously said this: if we lose India, the sun of our empire will have set. That was the significance that India had for the British Empire. It is very well known that India was a driver of growth of the British Empire, and in more ways than one. We all read about the Industrial Revolution that started globally from UK. The raw materials, the capital required for pushing that industrial revolution was all coming in from India. Thus, it was India who was the major driver of growth in Britain. It's unfortunate that India itself did not get any advantage out of it. But without India, and India being a part of the British Empire, Britain would not have been able to make the kind of progress that they did. And this is what we will study in this particular chapter. As I said, India was extremely crucial for Britain. And we gave a lot of things to Britain, not just the raw material. There was a large scale export of timber from India. There were a large scale export of a lot of Indian agricultural commodities, be it spices, be it cotton, all these things were exported to Britain and other parts of the world. There was a point in time that over half of India's external trade was only with Britain. And that is why it would not be wrong to reiterate the fact that India was actually the major driver of growth of Britain at that point of time. That's why India was an integral part which Britain just could not afford to lose. Now, let's take a deep dive into these issues one by one. First, let's start by understanding what exactly was the level of our development at the time of the colonial rule. We talk a lot about the fact that the British exploited our resources. We talk a lot about the fact that there was wide scale poverty, but what exactly was happening at that point of time? Let's take a few examples and see that. First, the British policies that were introduced in India were not really policies for the benefit of the Indians. The British made sure that almost all the policies that the British introduced in India were eventually for their own good. They were not concerned about whether or not it would impact the Indians positively. For example, we talk a lot about railways. Now, railways is a very interesting case study. As of today, if you look at the amount of railway track that we have in the length of railway track, it would be again an approximate measure would be close to 68,000 kilometers. Now, if you compare that to the amount of railway track we had at the time that the British left us, when the British left us, we already had about 50,000 kilometer of railways. So there's a big debate about whether the railways that the British built was actually good for Indians or not. Those who support the British say that when the British went away, Indians could not really build much more railways, which suggests that railways, expansion of railways in the country is only possible because the British had built a backbone. On the other hand, it's also true that if you look at what the British had in their mind while making the railways, it was that they wanted their industries to prosper. Railways allowed them to make sure that they can cut as much timber as possible in India and then export that. Export that, take it to the ports, and from the ports, then take it to Britain and other countries where they wanted. So while this infrastructure being built by the British may have been utilized by the local population as well to travel, to attend political rallies, to have national awakening, but it was majorly from the point of view of the British because they were the ones who wanted to use this infrastructure for their own good and for their own progress. And there is no doubt about that. A lot of raw material from India got exported forcefully because of the British. As I said earlier, a lot of forests were cut, a lot of crops that our farmers would not grow otherwise, such as indigo, etc., because they had a negative impact on the soil health. They were being forced to grow all that just for export purposes because we were under the control of a foreign power and we could not do anything else. These are some of the factors that suggest how our own indigenous industry was suppressed. For example, the British made sure that there was a suppression of handicrafts that was done at a very, very large scale. Even when the British were here, Indian handicrafts were well known around the entire world. Even today, Indian handicrafts are a big demanded item around the world. When the foreigners visit India, even today, a lot of them want to buy these handicraft items. These were something that faced a tough competition once the Industrial Revolution began and there was large scale manufacturing of stuff with the help of machinery. Let's imagine this situation. Let's say you go to an artist, the artist who actually makes a lot of wonderful paintings. So he has made a very intricate painting, spent many days on that. And because a lot of days have been spent, the artist demands 50,000 rupees for that painting. Now, the same painting you can just take a print out of by spending what 50 to 100 rupees. You might argue with him that why should I pay you 50,000 rupees? I can just get it printed, and you can. But the idea is that that's not handicraft. Handicraft comes at a cost. Handicraft has its own intricacies. The British made sure that Indian handicrafts were suppressed. Their demand around the world reduced. Even when they were demanded, the British made sure that they were so high taxed that the eventual cost of these handicraft items increased considerably. So there were efforts made from the side of the British to suppress the demand for handicrafts as much as possible, not just internally, but outside the country as well. For example, if somebody went to the market to buy something that was handmade, the British would try to push them towards buying something that was machine made that could be imported from Britain. Similarly, there was influx of the British goods. It's a very similar situation to what we have with China right now. Right now, most of the world's manufacturing, as you know, is focused on China. Just to put the matter into context here, do you have any idea how much of the world's global manufacturing happens from China? So, if you talk about the global manufacturing numbers, and I'm talking about today, if you talk about global manufacturing data, India's contribution to global manufacturing is close to 2.8%. Means about 2.8% of the products that are sold in the world are from India. They originate from India value wise. It's a pretty low number considering if you look at the proportion of India's population. India's population is about 17% of the world's population. So 17% of people in the world are Indians. And in proportion to that, our share in the global manufacturing is only 2.8%. On the other hand, compare that with China. Lump sum similar population as India. In fact, by all estimates, India has overtaken China. China's contribution in the global manufacturing today is about 28%. And this is the government data. This is the data from Economics Survey, as trustworthy a source that you can get. So China contributes 28% to global manufacturing today as compared to India contributing one tenth of that. Why am I telling you this here? Because a similar situation existed at that time, that Britain and India equation is similar to what China and India equation is right now. In terms of a lot of cheaper goods being in our market, people who are price conscious would often opt for those things that are cheaper, as it happens in the Indian market today. The reason you opt for Chinese products, despite knowing that their quality may not be up to the mark, is because they're cheaper, they are more affordable as compared to other stuff that is maybe Indian made. The same situation happened there as well. So there was a wide scale influx of British goods in India, often cheaper quality, but at least they were much cheaper to afford. The British did not impose any taxes on the British goods coming to India that allowed them to make it even cheaper. And when the Indian goods would go outside India, there was a huge tax imposed on that, making them much, much more expensive. Apart from that, the artisans had a negative impact because their handicrafts were not as valued as they were earlier. You know, when the British arrived before that, last big dynasty that we had were the Mughals. Now, in the Mughal dynasty, especially before Aurangzeb, most of these rulers did give patronage to different types of artists, depending upon whatever their preferences were. But they were artists that were actually given a lot of preference. However, when the British were here, they made sure that the artists are suppressed, the artists don't get their deserved due because their handicraft was never as much in demand as it should have been. There were also issues of collapse of industry. Again, all this is a chain effect that is happening here. If you look at the local industry in India, especially let's say take the example of cotton. India was a huge producer and exporter of cotton. But the British wanted to suppress that so that their own local cotton industry could get the kind of push, could get the kind of support that they required. And all these factors culminated into something which is very natural, which you see even today, that is the rise of unemployment and poverty. You would have heard and read about this from different accounts that the time that the British left India, almost all our industries were in ruins. Unemployment rate was extremely high. There was extremely dismal poverty levels because of all these factors. Because at the end of the day, the British were not really concerned about what benefits the people of the country. For them, their point of view was what benefits the British Empire, what keeps their midnight oil burning. Now, there are multiple theories given in this regard. One of them that we will discuss in detail that's given in this chapter is famously called as a drain of wealth theory. As I said in the beginning, you would have read about this in modern history as well. And this drain of wealth theory related questions have in fact been asked in the UPSC Prelims examination as well. The drain of wealth theory was given by Dadabhai Nairoji. And in simple terms, this is a theory that suggests that India was used by the British as a place from which they could drain as much wealth as possible and take it to the British shores. The British tried everything possible within their powers to make sure that India could not be left with any wealth whatsoever. It would be the natural wealth included, the wealth in terms of commodities, the wealth in terms of talent, any single thing that was of any value was taken by the British. For example, the British maintained a huge army in India. All of that were at the expense of India. They were not given any salary from the British Treasury or the British Exchequer. Add to that, even when the government of India, which was official run by Britain, they had certain officials that were placed in London who were working from so-called India office. Their salary also was given from the Indian shores only. So it was India and Indian economy, Indian people indirectly that had to pay for every single expense of their own rulers. Imagine a situation where someone is ruling over you against your wishes, and to make matters even worse, they are taking a hefty salary, and you are the ones who have to pay for that. And all of that resulted in extremely high levels of unemployment and poverty in the country. If you look at how British treated India, the idea was very simple. India was like that bank that they could exploit as much as possible. They made sure that they depleted as much resources from India as possible. They made sure that as much capital from India should outflow towards Britain as possible. And as I said earlier, there are multiple accounts to prove how India became the driver of industrial revolution in Britain. If India was not a part of the British Empire, their industrial revolution journey would not have been as successful as it turned out to be. On the other hand, the British stood to gain a lot out of India. Most of their economic gain, most of the financial influx, the capital that they required to rule over such large parts of the world was all sponsored from India. And the interesting part is it's not just about the money, it's about other resources as well. For example, look at the human capital aspect of it. The British fought multiple wars. Let's take an example of the two world wars only. In the First World War, India was nowhere near an active country which should have been involved in the war. But because the British were involved in the war, they made sure that the Indian soldiers were a part of this war machinery. The Indian soldiers, against their wishes, were taken in thousands to different places around the world to fight for the British. And the same happened during the Second World War as well. In the First World War, the efforts of the Indian soldiers were so praiseworthy from other countries around the world that countries such as the US forced England at the time of the Second World War to bring Indian soldiers despite Congress not being in support of this. So India was not just about a country or not just a country that was giving or helping the British Empire in terms of money. They're also helping them in terms of the human capital whenever required in situations such as war. One of the worst impacts of the British Empire in India was specifically on the agriculture sector in India. The British made sure that they introduced every single policy to extract as much value from Indian agriculture, Indian land as possible. For example, they took it as a major source of revenue, and different revenue collection systems were introduced around the entire country. Some of them had the infamous Rayatwari system, some of them had the Mahalwari system, and some of them had Zamindari system. Depending upon whatever the British thought would suit their interests the best, those kind of systems were deployed. Not just the revenue system, the other problem also was the introduction of middlemen or the zamindars. The people, farmers who used to work on the villages day in and day out for many, many years, they were never given the right of ownership over the land. They were always told that the land does not belong to you. You just have to pay revenue. You have to pay as much as your capacity and then even more. Not just this, even after all this revenue extraction was being done, the farmers were not free to decide what do they want to grow. The British intentionally pushed the farmers towards the crops that they thought would give them the best value in the international market. The most famous example, or the most interesting example, is the indigo production. Indigo, that was used to dye clothes, was an infamous crop notoriously because it left the soil in a much worse condition than what it used to be earlier. It took away all the productivity of the soil. So, not surprisingly, most of the farmers would avoid growing indigo on their fields. However, the British made sure that the farmers were pushed towards growing indigo on as much land as possible because the British thought that would give them the most value commercially, that they could sell that in the international market. The British also pushed the farmers towards cash crop cultivation. Now, please understand, when the British were here, India consistently suffered from multiple instances of famine. Means we had a situation where we did not have enough food grains. We could not supply enough food grains for our population. There was not enough wheat or rice available. And the major reason for that was the push that the British would give us towards cash crops because those are easier to sell. Those had a commercial value. The British were not concerned about whether we have enough food on our plate or not. And that also became a major problem where the focus was on things that we could not eat, but things that could sell easily in the market. It resulted in a situation of food insecurity, means we did not have enough food to eat. In fact, even today, countries learn from their past, we learn from our history. The one thing that we have learned from our history is successive governments in India make sure that we always have more than enough buffer stock with us now. I'm sure all of you would have read about the Food Corporation of India, FCI, that has thousands of godowns around the entire country. And they maintain a humongous buffer stock of especially wheat and rice so that if a famine like situation was to arise again, the government is ready with stocks with themselves so that they can actually release it into the market. This is a lesson that we took from the time of the British. When the British were here and they were not focusing on the food crops, India learned this lesson because we did not want a famine like situation to repeat itself. If you look at some of the numbers, some startling numbers that will tell you the story of India at that point of time, let's look at that. Let's look at the GDP growth rate. These days, when the government releases GDP growth rate of 6%, 5.5%, etc., we say it's low. We should have been 8, 9%. Imagine this situation. In the first half of the 20th century, India's GDP growth rate was about 2% per year. Just 2%. Imagine this situation. And again, this is about the first half of the 20th century. Before that, it was even lower. There was a stark decline in our GDP growth rate ever since the British had taken over the reins of the country. Then look at the per capita income, barely increasing by 0.5% per year. 0.5% per year. Just imagine this. If this was the situation today, the country would be on the verge of becoming a failed country. Then we had a situation of industrialization that was nowhere to be found. The British made sure that they do everything possible to discourage and dismantle whatever Indian industry existed at that point of time to give boost to the British industry, British capital goods coming into India. In terms of domestic demand, there was a decline in demand for local products because the British made sure that their products come into India without any taxation and thus they were easier to buy, they were more easily available around the entire country, and everyone would prefer those goods over the others. The British made sure that the production of Indian crops, Indian goods, Indian handicrafts, etc., was reduced, was cut down. All these factors added to the already existing economic issues that we had. And the British were able to make sure that our industry just does not go up or just does not progress at a respectable rate. There are various ways in which there were people who tried to estimate India's national income. There are multiple accounts that are given. We don't have one official account, but there were many people who tried to come up with their own data. Dadabhai Naroji, who famously came up with the drain of wealth theory, then William Digby, then there was Findlay Shears, there was R.C. Desai. All these people tried to estimate India's national income. But again, these were inconsistent because there was not much data available. Unlike today, the government did not really share much data back then. How much are we selling? How much are we earning? Import, export, taxation system. All of that was kept under wraps. So there is no one way to estimate what exactly was a per capita income, but almost all the accounts prove or show or indicate the fact that it was dismally low, specifically as compared to the other countries. Do remember some of these names. These are the notable economists of that time who focus on India. In terms of infrastructure building, also, there are two ways to look at it. As we discussed about railways a bit ago, the British, without a doubt, did build infrastructure in India. Roads, railways, ports. Whether they were built for themselves or they were built for Indians is a matter of debate. In fact, there is a wide scale consensus amongst the Indian historians that none of the infrastructure was built keeping Indians in mind. All the infrastructure was built specifically for the interest of the British. So while we do have about 50,000 kilometers of railway tracks to show at the time that the British left, it was mainly because the British wanted to transport goods, transport their troops in case they needed help at one place or the other. Similarly, the ports were built not because they wanted to send Indians abroad, they wanted to make it easier to send or to for the people to travel. It was mainly because they wanted the goods to be exported from India to Britain and vice versa. So yes, there was infrastructure built, there was irrigation facilities that were neglected at the same time. The things that were actually important for the farmers, despite the farmers paying huge amount of rentals, despite them paying huge amount of taxes and revenue, all of that was ignored, all of that was neglected because it did not fit into the larger schemes of things that the British had in their mind. And this is why all of this was neglected, leading to a situation of stagnation in our economic growth. If you look at the situation that the British had left us in, there's no doubt about the fact that India started from near zero. If you look at the economic backwardness that we had at time of 1947, stagnant economy, no one specific sector that could boast of having achieved something in the past few decades. The British system had ensured that there was no capital accumulation anywhere in the entire country. Very, very, very few people could say that, okay, we're industrialists, we still have some money in our hand, but mostly there was almost zero capital accumulation. The result of which was that when we became independent, it wasn't a choice that should the government boost the economy or not. The government had to. When we became independent, the major debate was about capitalism versus socialism. While countries such as the US wanted us to adopt capitalism, countries such as USSR wanted us to adopt socialism. The problem with capitalism is that this is a system that depends on private ownership and thus demands investment from private individuals. For that, there has to be some capital accumulated with the private individuals. But the situation was at the time of our independence, there was hardly any capital accumulated. So it was again the government's responsibility specifically to put as much money into the market. And it was thus an obvious choice for us to opt for socialism in place of capitalism. It was not just about our fondness of the system because of USSR. It was also because the situation that the British had left us in. Moving forward, we look into different sectors one by one that first chapter talks about. The situation in the industrial sector, agriculture sector, what were the different sectors that existed and where did we stand? Starting from the agriculture sector. Now, India, since that time till today, is a country that is heavily dependent on agriculture. For example, right now in the present context, about 46% of our workforce is involved in agriculture. That is the present data. And earlier, the situation was even worse in the sense that before, if you look at, let's say, the time of our independence, even more people were employed in agriculture. As you can see here, 85% of our population were dependent on agriculture in one way or the other. This number has come down to 46%. The government would want to reduce it even further. Why do we want to reduce it further? Don't we like agriculture? We do. The reason why the government wants to reduce it even further is because the government is of the view that agriculture suffers from something called disguised unemployment. We'll study about this later. But just to put this into context, disguised unemployment is a situation wherein, let's say, 10 people are doing a certain work, but that work could have been done by 3 people. Means out of the 10 people, if you remove the 7 people, the work will be done at the same speed, at the same efficiency. So those 7 people are not adding anything to it. So those 7 people are in a situation of disguised unemployment. That is the situation of our agriculture right now. That the number of people that are employed in agriculture are much, much more than what this sector actually requires. So if we cut down the workforce, it will not have any impact on the productivity of the agriculture workers eventually. So we, as in the government, would want to push people out from agriculture, would want to push people towards somewhere else. If there is a decline from 85%, we have reached 46%, but the government would want to bring it down even lower. Why? Because against 46%, how much is the agriculture actually contributing to the GDP? The contribution to GDP lump sum is 16%. Now imagine an activity that contributes 15% to your GDP, but deploys about 46% of your workforce, means there is some disproportion that you would want to correct here. That is why the government has been trying to see if there can be some alternate skill building activities that can be taken on, and we'll discuss those a bit later. In terms of the agriculture, the one big problem that Indian farmers faced at the time of the British was the land revenue policies. See, when the British came here and they announced that we are now the rulers of the entire country, that meant automatically all the land of India now belonged to the British. So automatically they were the rulers of the land, and then you had to pay revenue to them, you had to pay rent to them. This is where the situation became worse. The British introduced different types of system to extract as much revenue as possible. Zamindari system, Rayatwari system, and the Mahalwari system. There are questions asked on these systems. Where were they applicable? What was the major feature of these? Let's look at them one by one. First, the Zamindari system. The Zamindari system was specifically introduced in Bengal. Bengal was the largest, the most significant province of India at that time. As you know, till 1911, it was Calcutta that was the capital of British India before it was shifted to Delhi finally. It was in Bengal that this system was introduced, and it had, as the name suggests, an extremely important role of the Zamindars. The Zamindars were the one that used to collect the land revenue. Now, the interesting part here was Zamindar had to pay a fixed sum to the British. So, for example, the British would tell the Zamindar that I don't know what you do and how much money you take from the farmer. I don't care about that. I just want 1 lakh rupees from this piece of land. Now, imagine such a situation where the government tells the Zamindar, I don't care how much money you are taking from the farmer. You just need to give me 1 lakh rupees. How much you take from them, that's not my concern. Now what happens? Think of it from the Zamindar's point of view. If you are the Zamindar, your profit is in extracting as much money from the farmer as possible. Because if I know I have to pay fixed 1 lakh to the British, my profit will swell if I take 2 lakh, 3 lakh, 5 lakh from the farmers. So the more money that I take from the farmers, the better it is for me. That means eventually no one is thinking about the point of view of the farmer. No one is thinking what the farmer would want or what the farmer will like. The government is not telling the zamindar that you can only extract this much money from the farmer. The government has given a free hand to the zamindar. How much money you extract doesn't matter to us. You give us this much money. And the British government also set this sum at a pretty high value. They understood the fact that the zamindars had their rights or had their methods to exploit money from the farmers, so we might as well take a lot of money from the zamindars as well. And if the zamindars fail to give this money to the government would kick out that zamindar and appoint a new zamindar for that piece of land. Because the government's goal at the end of the day again was to earn as much revenue as possible. Doesn't matter who the zamindar is in that situation. Also, this led to exploitation of the cultivators because cultivation or cultivators or the farmers never officially were given the ownership. Now, what is the problem with not being given ownership? The problem with not being owners of the land means eventually, if you want, you cannot sell it off. Tomorrow, if you need money for something, if something wrong has happened and you think, okay, this is a piece of land where I have been working as a farmer for 50 years, 40, 30 years, this is mine. No, this is not yours. You can't even sell it. So just like the government could change the zamindars, if the zamindar thought the farmer is not being able to give them the money that is fixed, the zamindar would just kick out the farmer or the cultivator. So it was an overall exploitative system at all the levels, where the government would exploit the zamindar would exploit the cultivator, and this cycle continued because everyone was just trying to take out as much revenue, as much rent from this piece of land as possible. Second kind of a system that the British introduced was called the Rayatwari system. Now, the word Rayat means farmer. Now, this system was specifically put in place in these places, Madras, Bombay, and Assam. This piece of information is important, where in which parts of the country which system was deployed, because this has been asked in the prelims exam as well. As the name suggests, the Rayatwari system means the government will be directly in touch with the Rayat or with the farmer, rather than having a zamindar play the role of a middleman in between. So the tax structure, directly tax payment will be made by the peasants to the government. Government, on the other hand, did not give any support. Now, you might argue this was better than the zamindari system in the sense that at least we don't have a zamindar in between. But then on the other hand, it did not really have much of an incentive, in the sense that even though it was the farmers now who were directly paying the land revenue to the government did not really give anything in return to the farmer. In the sense, see, usually, again, I'm not saying it happened in India, what is the idea of giving tax to the government? The idea, the assumption, when you give tax to the government, you're assuming in return they will help you with the basic amenities. They will take care of roads, they will take care of development, they'll take care of at least government schools and hospitals, etc. That is an unwritten arrangement you have with the government, that I pay you taxes and you take care of all these amenities. But that was not the case in such as the Rayatwari system here. Even though the riots or the farmers would have to pay directly to the government, they would not get much in return. The government would not really take care of, let's say, investing in infrastructure or ensuring that irrigation is made better, or government schemes like the ones that we have today, like soil health card scheme, etc. Nothing like that was introduced. It was just about extracting as much money as the government could without giving anything in return to the farmers. It also led financial strain and impoverishment on the farmer. See, none of the three systems that we are discussing had anything good for the farmer. So don't compare in the sense that, oh, this was good, this was bad. All the systems are bad for the farmers. Thus, the difference was that in certain cases, the farmers would be directly dealing with the government without the zamindar or the middleman being in between. And in some cases, the government would appoint someone in between. That was a difference, but it was not about less or more exploitation as such in any kind of a system. The third famous system at that time was something called the Mahalwari system. What is Mahal or Mahalwari? So Mahal basically means Sarpanch or Pradhan or whatever you want to call it, depending on whichever state you are in. Village headman. Now, in this system, as the name suggests, in this system, the entire village would give the revenue to the mahal or to the village headman, to the sarpanch. It would be his or her responsibility then to then submit all that with the government authorities. So instead of the zamindar, in this case, that middleman position is taken by the mahal or middleman position is taken by a village headman. This system was mainly seen in Northwest Province, Punjab, and Central India. That again was no less exploitative in nature. It again exploited agriculture communities because the British wanted to extract as much revenue as possible from these cases as well. The tax was collected from the entire village, and it was the entire responsibility of the village headman to bring this tax to the government. And if they failed to do that within the given timeline, they would have to face punishment from the British. So that is how the system was. Again, don't compare these systems by thinking, oh, this was good, this was bad. All of these were bad. It was just about choosing between bad and worse. It was not between good and bad. Every system was bad. It was just that this way of taking the revenue was different. From the examination point of view, do remember these three systems and specifically the places where they were operational, because this has been asked by UPSC in the past. Apart from that, apart from the land revenue system that the British had introduced, they also made sure that they exploit agriculture as much as possible by these methods. First, they introduced cash crops and shifted the farmers forcefully from things that we could eat, things that are usually consumed, from things that could be sold easily in the market. So there was a consistent push to the farmers to go from crops, from grain towards cash crops. So things such as cotton, tea, jute, indigo, tobacco, which were not essentially consumed in India in large quantity at that point of time. But the British forced the farmers to cultivate these because they had much more commercial value. And the British knew that they could sell it at a good price. Add to that the food insecurity that took place. There was extreme famine in the country, and there are so many different accounts of thousands of people dying in India. There's a very famous or infamous incident in 1940s when India had a great famine, thousands of people died. One of the reasons was that the food grains, etc., were taken out of India to serve the British soldiers in the Second World War. The story is that someone told Winston Churchill, that is the British Prime Minister at that time, that there's a large scale famine in India, thousands of people are dying, we should do something. What do you think? And his question was, first tell me, has Gandhi died already or not? That was a concern of the British. It was not a one off instance of famine taking the lives of people in India. It had become a very, very common feature at the time that the British were here, because the focus of the farmers was shifted from grains, from food production towards cash crops that could be sold in the market. Then the situation of frequent famines, as I told you. And this is why India was so adamant after our independence that we will work on green revolution. We will read about green revolution in a few later chapters. The reason why we wanted to work on something like green revolution was because we have had this history of famines, a history where people did not have enough food to eat, history where we just could not support our entire population, and we did not want to repeat that situation again. It was a lesson that we had learned from the time that the British were here. It also led to increase in the poverty level, because when you don't have enough food to eat, you don't have enough food supply in the market, the simple inflation rate rule is that when the supply decreases, the rates of the commodities will go up. We will discuss about inflation and everything as we go ahead, but just to introduce this term to you, in economics we will come across this term quite often called inflation. Inflation simply means general increase in price, general price rise. When I say general price rise, what it means is increase in price of not one or two commodities. It's a general increase in price. Like, for example, most of the things around you that you see today were cheaper 10 years ago. Be it the chocolate, be it the food that you're eating, be it anything that you see around you. Most of the things were cheaper 10 years ago. So there's a general price rise because of inflation. We'll discuss later how inflation happened, but the simple rule is when something is on short supply and the demand is still very strong, a lot of people want it, the price will automatically increase. That is what happened with the food grains also. Then exploitation of indigo cultivation also played a major role. As I said, indigo was nothing but a cloth dye, blue colored dye, that would give a lot of vibrant colors to indigo through the cloth. And the British had discovered that it can be grown in India and it had a significant demand around the world. They were not concerned about the fact that indigo production is extremely harmful for the soil quality. It takes away a lot of nutrients. It does not leave the soil in a good condition. They were not concerned about that. The British were only concerned about how much money can they gain out of it, and that is where farmers suffered, while the British still forced the farmers to grow crops such as indigo later on. We had a situation in agriculture where we had stagnation, means there was no growth as such in agriculture because there was no investment being made. See, the reason why industrial revolution took place in countries such as England and Germany was that a lot of new machines and technology was introduced. The things that were being done with hand before or earlier were now being done with the help of machines. So it became easier for them to work, to get more productivity, to have more production. All of that became easier. But nothing of that sort was being done in Indian agriculture. We were still using old those techniques. Everything was done with hand. There was no groundbreaking discovery that was happening here. There was lack of investment in irrigation. India has anyways always been a monsoon dependent country. We are a country that still is a lot dependent on rain when it comes to irrigation or water availability for our food crops. Now we have a situation where there are tube wells, etc. There are canals that are being built. But at that point of time, the British had made no such arrangement. And that is why, if there was a bad monsoon season, the farmers had no other option but to suffer and see their loss of their crops. There was also negligible use of fertilizers or any scientific method, because again, all these things required a lot of study, and the British were just not interested in that. It is now that we see so much fertilizers and pesticides and all these high yield variety of seeds that are used, but nothing at that time was at the focus of the British government. There was also a problem of fragmented land holding. Now, this is a problem that exists even today. See, it is proven beyond any doubt now that the lesser the size of the land holdings, lesser is the productivity. Let's understand what I'm trying to tell you. Now, the one problem that we have in Indian agriculture is the size of the land holding is very small. Why? Let's understand. Let's assume there's a farmer that has 10 acres of land. Okay. So 10 acres, good amount of land, no issues at all. In the next generation, let's say the farmer has 5 children, which is very common or which used to be very common in rural areas. So if they have 5 children and all these 5 have no other skills, have no other occupation, they would have to undertake agriculture only. So in the next generation, what will happen? The land will be divided amongst these 5 into 2 acres each. So now a farmer has 2 acres of land, which is much lesser. Now this farmer, let's say again, has 4 children dependent on agriculture. So now everyone would have only half acre of land. Now imagine a situation where within 2 generations, a land holding has gone from 10 acres to only half acres. Now what is the problem here? The problem, as I said here, is the more you fragment the land holdings, the lower is the productivity. So let's say this guy has enough input and can buy good seeds and actually can able to make a difference, and he would be able to have good cultivation. But maybe He does not have any other resource, so his 2 acre land is going to waste. He can't buy seeds, he can't buy fertilizers. So when you have small land holding like these, when you have small and marginal farmers, this is where the problem starts. And it's the problem we have even today in India. If you look at productivity, again, not overall production, but productivity. Productivity means how much crop do you have per acre of land or per unit area of land. In terms of that, India's productivity is still very, very, very low. That is why if you look at countries such as China, for example, one thing that China did in 1970s was that they introduced something called cooperative farming. Cooperative farming is a kind of a solution to this problem. It was introduced in China in 1970s. The idea of cooperative farming is simple, that small land holdings, so all these, let's say, are individual owners, the government will force them to combine all of their land together. That this should be treated as one single land. This is what the government will say. There should be one single land and everyone should work together. You should divide your labor. One person should water the field, one person should do the cropping, one person should do the harvesting, etc. And then you should divide the profit. This is called cooperative farming. Like that is how the corporates work. Like the cooperatives that we have, let's say Amul is a cooperative in India, works in a similar manner. But this is not that easy to do. You have to get everyone to accept this idea. If someone says, no, I'm not in support of this, they will not join their land. The reason why they were able to do this in China is because China has a kind of a government where you can't really deny whatever they want. Because of the authoritarian government that China had, they forced the farmers to take cooperative farming, and the result is today they have much higher, much better productivity than India. Productivity as in, if you have 1 acre of land, in that 1 acre, how much wheat are you able to grow as compared to how much wheat grows in India in that 1 acre of land. In case of China, that number is larger. Because of these things, and in India, the fragmentation of land has made sure that productivity has remained lower. We have been talking about multiple famines that India has faced. There are some examples that you can see here. One of the most infamous were the Bengal famine 1770. There was the Doji Bara famine, again 1790 is a great famine, the Bengal famine, very close to our independence. This was the one I was talking about when Churchill asked whether Gandhi has already died or not. And together, millions and millions of people died in these famines. Imagine a country where the primary occupation is agriculture only. In that country, when lakhs of people are dying because of famine, it is nothing but a shame. And that was because the British had their own ulterior motives and they were not concerned about the well being of the general population in India or well being of the farmers in India. Amartya Sen, the famous Nobel Prize winner, famously analyzed that famines were actually often because of the failure of the food distribution system rather than the absolute food shortage. That was his view. Meaning, his idea was that we were still producing enough for our population, but it just did not reach the people. As I said earlier, there was a situation where a lot of food grains were being taken out of India specifically to feed the British soldiers who were fighting the Second World War. They were the ones who were given the priority. This is what Amartya Sen is pointing towards here. Most of the policies of the British, as we said, were focused on revenue, were focused on extracting as much money as possible out of this. It primarily was about getting as much money for the military operations, getting as much money for fighting multiple wars that they were involved in at that point of time. Be it the zamindari system, where zamindars were then told to get as much money as possible, be it the rayatwari system or the mahalwari system, all of them had an extremely, extremely high rate of revenue. And again, high taxation system in today's time can only be justified if you have a situation where you are returning that money in the form of research or investment being done for the general welfare of the people. When you have a situation where the government says, okay, I'm spending money to research on new fertilizer or new crop variety or new variety of seed, that did not happen. And this is where the problem basically occurred in Indian agriculture at the time of the British. If you look at the production data that we had, according to this first chapter, at the end of the 19th century, agricultural productivity was largely stagnant. The growth rates were negligible. Most of the land reforms that we saw in India were post our independence, and we will discuss as the time goes on. The land reforms that came up after independence were the ones that tried to revive agriculture in India. Abolition of zamindari, the land ceiling bill, tenancy reforms. All this was after independence when we thought that we have to give something to our farmers. But at the time that the British were here, there was absolutely no focus on farming and farming productivity. The other sector of our economy that again faced same kind of issues, same kind of problems, or even worse in agriculture was the industrial sector. It's not unfair to say that the problems that the British had inculcated in our industrial sector have still not been taken away. We are still, after over 75 years of independence, we are still in a situation where the government still is trying to give a push to industries, to manufacturing. We have been launching projects such as Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, etc. But despite all of that, we are still in a situation where still needs to be done. I'll give you a simple example here before we go ahead from today's context. You know that the government has been working extremely hard to give a push to manufacturing. As I said, multiple schemes have been launched. There is a PLI scheme also, production linked incentive scheme, that has been launched. But just to put things into context here, in 2014, when Prime Minister Modi first came to power, in 2014, the contribution of manufacturing in our GDP was 17%. So manufacturing contributed 17% into our GDP. As you know, over half of contribution is always of services. Then there is agriculture, and then there is manufacturing. So in 2014, manufacturing contributed 17%. The government since then has done a lot of things. Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, PLI schemes have been launched. Many sectors have been given a push. Government has said, we will give you the loan, or we'll act as a guarantor to the loan. Factories of defense have also been set up, right? Cut to today. Do you know how much contribution of manufacturing do we have today in our GDP? 13%. I am rounding it off. Now imagine a situation. This is where we are. I am not saying it was because what the British did, but it does help when you trace it back to the situation where the British had actually left us. From the situation where the British had left us, this is where we have come, because we were so far behind. There were many other factors at play even today, but the industrial sector has been a struggle for us for a very long time. When the British came here, the idea was that they wanted to push our indigenous industries down and replace them with imported stuff coming in from the British. Not just did they ensure that India's products become more expensive, that when they move out of the country, they have to pay a lot of taxes. They also made sure that the British products coming into India were much cheaper. They made sure that the British products enter India without any fees, without any taxes. There was no duties involved there. All of that was done so that there is a big price difference in British products and Indian products. And a price sensitive market like India, Indian consumer would opt for the British products. And this is where the problem started. If you look at the decline of traditional industries that we saw in India, that is a deindustrialization, British deliberately destroyed our traditional industries. The idea was simple: put extremely high tariff on Indian products, and on the other hand, allow the British products to enter India in a duty-free situation. Again, if you have to understand the situation or the relationship between British and India in terms of these goods, imagine India's situation with China today. Imagine a situation if today the government says Chinese products will come to India without any taxes. Let's imagine that. Why would anyone not buy Chinese products then? Because in a country that is like India, that's a developing country, you can't expect people not to opt for the cheapest product just because they have a feeling of patriotism. Feeling of patriotism is one thing, but when you go to a market and you want to buy an air conditioner, Indian air conditioner is for 60,000, Chinese one is of 30,000. Doesn't matter what you feel. At the end of the day, you will think, let me buy 30,000 one, let me save some money, right? The same was the situation that time when the British were here. Our handmade textiles were pushed down. The British made sure that there is absolutely no demand for these textiles. Also, there was a decline in the handicrafts. There was a lot of unemployment, all these situations, and the British were not doing anything about that at all. These were the objectives of the British industrial policy in India when they were here. First, extract as much raw material as possible and then send it to Britain. So, whatever cotton, jute was being produced was sent to Britain so that they could make the final product, and that final product would come back to India at a much higher price. Imagine a situation that's another type of round tripping. You're making raw material in this country, then you're not making the finished product here because that will be expensive. So you send this raw material to Britain, use your machines, make the finished product, send it back to India, and force the Indians to buy that at a higher price. That is what the British were doing under their policies. Our own industries did not get any growth. There was no sharing of technology, no sharing of any innovation. You would have noticed now, whenever the government of India signs any defense deal specifically, we focus a lot on this term called technology transfer. Have you heard that? For example, when the government says we'll buy Rafale planes from France, or the government says we'll buy S-400 missile defense system from Russia, the government insists on the fact that we want technology transfer. Means we do not just want to buy the product, we also want to learn how have you made it so that we can make it in the future. This is something the British never did for us. Our industries were never given the technical know-how, no machines were given to us, no knowledge was given to us on how to make it better. On top of that, India's market was also exploited. Means the Indian population. See, India has always been a highly populous country in any time frame. It's not that now we have a highest population around the world, but even if you say the time of our independence, India was never a country with a lesser population as compared to we have usually always been at pretty high population country. That is what makes it pretty exciting and a very attractive country to those who want to sell their products. Like, why is it that China cannot afford a full-fledged war with India? Because India is a huge market for their products. So they will be doing more harm to themselves by having a full-fledged war. Similarly, over here, the British wanted to exploit the Indian market, wanted to exploit the Indian laborers or Indian rather consumers so that they could buy British products at a cheaper price. This is what held them out. All these are objectives, not just take raw material out from India, also force Indian consumers to buy the British products, which will be sold to them at a price which is higher because raw materials are being taken out. You can't make it within your country. All this was done intentionally by the British. The British by themselves had been able to work on their own machines. They, whenever, even when they set up some of the factories in India, they made sure that this was mainly controlled by the British. Like the jute mills are predominantly owned by the British, they were located in Bengal. Although the cotton mills were predominantly owned by Indians, but very quickly the British started to dump their cotton products into India. Like Manchester became a very famous center of making cotton products that were then being sent to India. So it was done intentionally bit by bit to make sure that almost all the industries where India could be proud of, almost all the industries where India could actually gain some kind of prominence, all that was being subdued in India. Not just this, if you look at, for example, the iron steel industry. Now, iron steel is a very, very, very important industry for any country. Imagine a situation where World War One, World War Two was being fought. During wars, especially iron and steel industry take predominance over any other kind of industry, because they are the ones that will give you the raw material for making your weapons, for making your artillery, for making your equipment. This is when India saw the emergence of a big company called Tisco that exists even today. The Tata Iron and Steel Company. It was started in Jamshedpur 1907. See, the British did try everything to make sure that our own companies or our own products do not take any prominence, but there was some exception. Tatas were one of them. It was the first major industrial enterprise in India that at least gave a kind of semblance that at least there is an Indian company that does exist. Amongst the capital good industry, India did not have much. We are highly dependent on the British machineries coming to India. Capital goods basically means machines, etc., for manufacturing purposes. Those again came from British. They were not really manufactured in India. India did not really have a base of that. These are expensive things that you would buy from outside. And when they would enter India, you have to pay a much higher price for them. This is where the British saw an opportunity to extract even more revenue from the country. If you look at the industry sector in India and their contribution to the GDP, it was not very high. We still had some of the bits going in textiles, iron, steel, etc. But again, their contribution to GDP was not very high. There were not exact numbers available, but it was not very highly contributing to our GDP growth. Most of the industrial development was in a very, very few regions. Bombay, Bengal, these were the only few regions where the British had allowed some kind of development. No other efforts were made, for example, to get the fruits of development spread far and wide. For example, if you just compare that to today's context, the government is trying to develop more and more urban centers. There is the Amrut mission, for example. There is something called the Smart Cities mission. What are these initiatives? These are initiatives to build more urban centers so that population is not just concentrated into a few centers across the entire country. That is a big problem that we have right now. For example, and I often ask this question, if let's imagine a situation, let's say you have done your MBA or a good degree and you're now thinking of a job in a private sector, and you want to aim to get settled into a city that will give you a good job, good standard of living, etc. Think of a city in India where you would want to settle. You can ask this question to thousands of people. The list of cities that you will get is 8 to 10. Thousands and lakhs of people will only give 8 to 10 cities and no more than that. Delhi NCR, Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, Pune, maybe Ahmedabad. You would not go beyond 10. The problem that we have right now is when you have all your development concentrated in just a few cities, the problem with that is you are basically telling the entire population of the country that these are the cities where you have to come if you want to have a good future. Otherwise, in other cities, there is no infrastructure, nothing else. This is why you will see all these cities being overpopulated, suffering from issues such as traffic jam, suffering from issues such as uh, floods, drought, you name it. All these are issues that the government is trying to tackle by doing this. Having more cities that can be set up as urban centers, developing more infrastructure in other urban cities, all of this is being done because the government wants to have more cities set up like that. Now, if you look at the industrial backwardness that India has been seeing, again, it's something that you expect. When the British were here, 1947, we had an extremely weak industrial base. There was no diversification. There were one or two private enterprises, the example of Tisco that we took. But apart from that, nothing much to actually boast of. The other aspect of Indian economy that was deeply neglected by the British was the foreign trade. Now, there are no data points that you can be sure of from that point of time because there was no organization such as the UN or IMF or the World Bank that could give you credible data. But by all accounts, it is safe to assume that India had a very flourishing foreign trade. A lot of the products from India were in great demand around the entire world. Natural products, be it spices, cotton, or even the finished products such as the handicrafts. However, just like all other sectors, in this sector as well, when the British came, and by the time that the British left, it was actually left in almost tatters. The British made sure that they stopped India's valuable export to other countries. All the exports were taxed extremely, extremely highly so that the foreign trade becomes almost negligible. The British made sure that all the trade was monopolized by them and it was highly regulated. As I said, the only kind of foreign trade that the British would encourage was raw materials from India, leaving Indian shores going to Britain, them being converted to finished products of a higher value, coming back to India and then being sold at a higher price. This was the only kind of foreign trade the British were interested in because the price difference allowed them to earn significant amount of money. The price difference from the raw material to the finished product played well in the interest of the British. If you look at India's trade dynamics at that point of time, this is how it looked. Exports were mainly of raw silk, raw cotton, wool, sugar, jute, tea, spices. So basically, cash crops that the British could sell, or the product that the British could use to make finished products like cotton, silk, jute. These are products that the British could use in their machinery and finish or make a finished product that was an in demand in other parts of the world and in India as well. Then we had imports of finished goods in India, such as silk, woolen textiles, capital machinery that was imported mainly from Britain. All these things were imported in India from British, and again British taxed them extremely highly so that they could earn margins from there as well. In terms of the capital goods, machinery, tools were again imported in India. India was ensured that no industry would actually self grow, would actually grow indigenously in the country. The British made sure of that, that the foreign trade was in their favor. Now, these kind of things, do remember, they can ask this in the prelims: what were the important commodities exported out of India at the time of our independence? What were the commodities that we were dependent on importing at that time? The British maintained a monopoly over trade. They made sure that whatever trade happens and whenever products leave India, they mainly go to Britain. In fact, over half of India's trade was with Britain at that point of time. Now, if I tell that in today's context, today India has half of the trade with Britain, it might not be a bad thing. That would mean that we are earning a lot of foreign exchange, but not at that point of time. It was a highly exploitative trade, not something that was done by choice, but it was something that was forced upon us specifically. The remaining trade was mainly in the neighboring countries that we had: China, Ceylon, that was Sri Lanka of that time, Persia, that was Iran. These are the countries from where the other trade usually used to happen, but mostly the trade was towards Britain only. And again, the trade of raw materials going to Britain and finished products and capital goods, extremely expensive goods, coming into India. The Indian traders, manufacturers were deprived of getting any access to the market of other parts of the world because the British wanted to make sure that their products from their industrial revolution gain as much market space around the entire world as possible. So not only did they want to continue their rule in India, they also wanted to make sure that Indian businesses never thrive enough so that they can become a competition for the British. One landmark event that took place that changed the journey of India and other countries around the world was the opening up of the Suez Canal. Suez Canal, as you know, is by far the most important trading route in the world. It's an artificial canal that was opened in 1869. It's so important it has been at the center of multiple wars since then. This canal reduced transportation time between India and Britain considerably. For those who don't know, let me give you an idea what I'm talking about. Look at this. This is the Suez Canal, artificially built water body here. What it did was it basically connected the Mediterranean, that is here, with the Red Sea, that is here. Earlier, if a product had to be sent from Britain to India or India to Britain, this was a route that they had to take. So they had to go around all the way around Africa to reach India, which was close to 20,000 kilometers. Now, with the Suez Canal being artificially made here and the water body being created here, it allowed the ships to take a much shorter route from London to India and vice versa. It cut down the distance by about 40% length. The distance was 11,600 kilometers. It made sure that the products could now be imported and exported in a much shorter time frame. And that gave a big boost to these products. Not just the products, it was also an important trade route for transportation of military personnel as soon as possible. It later on became extremely important at the time of the world wars. So important that even today, if you look at Egypt, a huge part of the revenue that the government of Egypt earns is just through the Suez Canal, which was jointly built by the British and the French. Every ship that passes through it has to pay a huge amount of fee, just like you do by tolls. When you're moving on the highway, you have to pay toll. Similarly is the case here. That changed the game for British import and export from Britain and other colonies that Britain had in Asia and other parts of the world. At the same time, the surplus export and the drain of wealth continued. The British made sure that they used their colonies for large export surplus. Whatever surplus we had was never utilized for India's development. It was all used by the British or their own industrial experts. The British made sure that all the expenses that they had, even on India's behalf, were actually given by Indians. There's something called home charges. Home charges basically simply means that the Indians who are working, let's say, for the East India Company and later on who are working in the British government but on behalf of India means, for example, in London, there was an India office where people used to sit in London, but they were responsible for looking into affairs of the Indian government. Their salary, their expenses, all of that would go from India, from Indian pockets. Those are home charges. All these are components of the drain of wealth that Dadabhai Naoroji was talking about. The drain of wealth theory was an attempt by people such as Dadabhai Naoroji to actually tell people around the world, see, this is how British are exploiting India. It was also done so that Indians themselves realize how bad the British rule is in India. You would have read this in modern history that the first few Congress leaders used to be the moderates. And one of the things that the moderates focused on was not using force but educating people, telling them about how bad the British rule is, making sure that the people are educated enough to take a call. A part of this was popularizing the drain of wealth theory to make the people more aware about how bad the British rule was and how actually we are paying for every single thing that the British are imposing on us. These were some of the important components of the drain of wealth theory. It led to economic exploitation because heavy taxes were imposed by the British government, taxes on the farmers, taxes on Indian products. When Indian products used to go outside, then when the British product would come here, there was no taxes so that it could be easily sold in the Indian market. Drain of wealth also meant loss of resources. All our local resources, there was a huge amount of timber that was cut to lay down the railway lines, and a lot of that was exported to Britain to help in their own industrial revolution and their own long-term growth. Then there was a problem of profit repatriation. Any profit that the British would earn, for example, let's say from railways. Running of the railways, it was a British enterprise. Any profit that they would earn from that would not be utilized for India's development. It was not that the British government is earning something or the Indian government rather is earning something that should be utilized for India. No, all that money went back to Britain. All that money, all that profit was utilized by the British government for taking forward their exploitative nature over all the colonies, including India. It was also met with negative impact on the society because all of that meant no investment in India in any of the social fields, no investment in building human capital. That means there was a long cycle of unemployment and poverty in India, which was very difficult for India to come out of. All these were parts of what you call as a drain of wealth theory. There were multiple negative aspects of the trade policy that the British had introduced. The domestic industry, the growth was negligible. The domestic industry had very, very tough competition to face from other parts of the world. Because of no capital accumulation, they could not invest in any new kind of technology. There was absence of industrial growth. All the raw materials, etc., just went out of India without India having any role to play or India having any ability to use that for their own good. We also have to understand what were the demographic features of India at that point of time. Means the time that the British left us around the time of our independence, what was the situation in terms of India's society? Demography basically means composition of the society, average age, literacy rate, all these things come in demography. Now, at the time when the British were here, there was almost zero focus of the government on building human capital, human resource. Later on, we have a chapter in class 11 NCERT about human capital, human resource. That simply means government's investment in building more skills in the people. For example, you see in the country, the government invests a lot in, let's say, healthcare facility, education facilities, infrastructure. All that is done so that the people can actually make a better career, the people can actually make better lives for themselves and contribute to the national growth. This is why the governments usually keep on tracking parameters such as literacy rate, mortality rate, average age, etc. All that is calculated so that the government can see whether our human capital is up to the mark or not. At the time of the British, we had extremely low literacy rate, extremely low life expectancy, widespread poverty, widespread diseases, famine, you name it. Almost all the parameters that should be up were extremely low. All the things that required investment from the British had almost zero investment because they just could not care less. The British started the census exercise in India in 1881. As you know, every 10 years a census is conducted. 2021 census, by the way, has not been conducted so far. The government delayed it, first saying that it's because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the government has not explained why have they delayed it. But it started in 1881 with every 10-year interval. The idea was to ensure that the government has appropriate data about the population. Census accuracy has always been challenged, and that is why every single census we see new kind of technologies coming up. But census does give a fair bit of data about how many people are in the country, the composition, the rural urban population, etc. One more interesting part here. You have seen in our politics, there's a lot of talk about caste census in the past few years. It has become a big issue between the ruling party and the opposition parties. Many opposition parties demanding that we should have a caste-based census. Remember, the last caste-based census in India's history was in 1931. That was before independence. Last caste-based census. Now, please remember a few things here. When the census data is collected, when people would come and ask you for your information, they do collect data about scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So we do have exact numbers about scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the country. But the government does not have exact numbers about the OBC population. because caste based census is not conducted in India. It's very weird because that is the group that has the highest reservation in India, but for them we don't have the exact numbers. 1931 was the last time that we had the caste census. The interesting part is the 2011 census that was conducted, it did collect caste data. The government did collect caste data, but interestingly, government never released it. Why? Government said that we think that this data is incorrect. Slightly controversial, but you can't force the government to come out with this data. The government said we think that there were inaccuracies in collecting that data, so we did not release that. The last data released of caste-based census was in 1931, not after that. Do remember. One more thing, if you're thinking what did the Bihar government do recently, government of Bihar came out with some numbers. What the Bihar government did was they conducted what is called as caste survey. Please understand this. As per the law, census in India can only be conducted by the central government. State governments can't conduct census. But because the Bihar government wanted to come out with this data about population and the base of caste, they found a loophole here. They collected the data in the name of making better policies, making more targeted policies, but they did not call it a census because then it would not have been allowed. They call it a survey. So Bihar came out with a caste-based survey, but caste-based census we have not had since 1931. Here are some numbers or data about population growth. India remained in the first stage of demographic transition until 1921 and then entered the second stage. Now, what are these stages of demographic transition? See, depending upon a country's progress, the country's birth and death rate cycle changes. Please understand this. It is said that the first stage of a country's progress is high birth rate and high death rate. That's when a country is illiterate, country doesn't have much development. Because you're illiterate, you would be having high birth rate. Because you don't have many medical facilities, you would have high death rate also. You can't really save a lot of people, you would have many diseases. Slowly, the country then transitions into a situation of high birth rate and low death rate. High birth rate, why? Because controlling birth rate is difficult, controlling death rate is easy, because if you make enough industrial development, enough progress in technology, you have better healthcare, you have better medical facilities, you would be able to bring down the death rate. So the situation where we are in, for example, as a country, we are somewhere here high birth rate, low death rate, and then it comes to a stage of low birth, low death rate. Countries such as Japan, for example, developed countries are at low birth rate, low death rate. When people are knowledgeable enough to understand that high population is bad for them, so they control their population. And at the same time, we have enough medical facilities and technology and healthcare to have low death rate as well. This is where we are. Now, again, as I said, controlling birth rate is difficult because that is an individual's decision. China did something called the one child policy. They made it mandatory not to have more than one child, but we did not do that. At the time of the British, we had a very, very high growth rate. The death rate started to come down because, again, of more and more technological advancement that have been made. In terms of literacy, at the time that we became independent, literacy rate was lump sum 16%. Imagine, only 16% at the time that we became independent. Out of that, if you look at the female literacy rate, it was just 7%. Just 7% female literacy rate. This was the state of literacy rate, the state of human progress that we had, because the British had no interest in improving our literacy rate. Even when they did, for them, most of the focus was on preparing people who could take up clerical jobs that the British require out of them. There was zero focus on free thinking. There was zero focus in making people much more free or much more technologically advanced. There was all the focus on making them do managerial stuff, clerical stuff, so that they can be used for the British. Public health, etc., was neglected very, very, very badly. Just imagine a situation right now. Today, we have a government that is trying to improve public health, spending money in public health, but still public health situation is not that good. Now, when we had a situation where the government was not even trying, imagine how worse the situation would be. At least now the government is trying to make sure that we don't have a lot of death and we invest a lot in health, although it's still much lesser than where we should be. But back then the government was not even trying. Imagine that kind of a situation. The public health facilities were non-existent. There was almost zero attention given to them. There were many waterborne diseases, airborne diseases. There was bad water that people were drinking. There was absolutely no sanitation facility. India had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world. Imagine 218 infant mortalities per thousand. Can you imagine this? Means if 10 children take birth, more than 2 will die. That's how bad the situation was. That was also why you see so many children of the high population rate, because the parents were sure that if they have, let's say, 4 kids, 1 or 2 will not survive. And that's why they had high birth rates. That was a part of a problem. Life expectancy at that time was around 32 years. See how bad it was. Around 32 years was the expected life of an Indian at that point of time, because the healthcare facilities were so bad, were so out of order. That is just because there was absolutely zero investment made by the government, made by the authorities in improving these healthcare facilities. Sanitation, almost non existent. The diseases that were widespread, the sufferings did not really make any difference to the British. Most of the people, for example, today, why is it that you talk about slums being a problem? People live in slums because they don't have a choice. Let's say 20 people came to Delhi for a job, or 100 people come to Delhi for a job, and they can't afford to rent a house or rent a PG because they don't have money. So what do? Wherever they find any empty space in the city, they just live there, or they just try and put a tent there, or let's say a rough settlement. That becomes a slum, which has no proper water supply, no sanitation, no facilities. That becomes the center of all these diseases that are being spread. In fact, do you know the word slums, or the origin of the slums, also came in from Britain? When industrial revolution took place around 18th 17th century, when 18th century, when a lot of people moved from rural area to the urban area to work in factories in London and other Manchester, etc., they had no houses to live in. So what would they do? 10, 20, 30 of them would live in very small household with almost no sanitation facility, and that is what led to this situation of slums and diseases being spread. There was zero emphasis on any kind of nutrition. We suffered from wide scale lack of nutrition amongst children, especially. There was no balanced diet available. We also had zero medical care. As I said, there were high scale suffering. There was no effort from the side of the government to actually protect them. The ones who could afford may have some, but see, overall medical education itself was neglected, so there were just not enough doctors. The handful of doctors that we did have would only be able to cover the people who would be able to pay for them, and the scale of population that we had, it required the government to set up their government facilities, public healthcare facilities. That was not the case, and this is where the situation became even worse. There were the demographic disparities. For example, the literacy standards obviously were better in the urban areas than the rural areas, which is the case even today. Even today, we have not been able to cover the gap, but at that time, it was extremely, extremely bad. Whatever little symbolic development, whatever little symbolic infrastructure was built, It was mainly built in the urban areas. The rural areas lacked any of that, and that is where this situation meant even worse conditions for the rural areas. If you look at it from the present day context, as I said, a lot of these problems you might think and say, oh, even today they exist, which is not wrong. Even today, many of these problems do exist. But at least we now have the government caring for it and introducing new things, introducing new policies for that. We have the National Health Mission, we have the universalization of education, we have the PDS system, we have the vaccination programs, etc., running, a lot of them free of cost to at least give basic care, basic healthcare facilities to anyone, even those who cannot afford. You might not like the government health infrastructure, but at least that is available for those who can't afford to go to private healthcare structure. So there is still a long way to go, but at least, yes, you do have a government, or the government in power do at least care and do try and bring in changes here. What was the occupational structure back at that time? Where were people deployed? How were people engaged in the society? Now, if you see, mostly people were deployed in agriculture. As we discussed, 85% of the workforce was deployed in agriculture back then. Very little in manufacturing, and even more little in terms of services, because there was not much to offer in terms of services. So most of the focus always was on agriculture. Let's see. In terms of the numbers, 70 to 75% of working age population was engaged in agriculture. It was a primary source. But the problem is, it was also the focus of most of the economic exploitation by the British. It was the agriculture that was the most taxed. It was agriculture which the British wanted to extract the most out of. It was agriculture that lacked any occupational structure, be it the zamindari system, be it the raitwari system, be it the mahalwaris who had come in. All these systems were just aimed at exploiting as much from the British as much from agriculture rather as possible. Even today, if you look at the composition of our workforce, as we discussed earlier, majority of them would still be in agriculture only. The 46% workforce is deployed still in agriculture. And as we discussed earlier, the undisguised unemployment problem still exists. But having three-fourths of your population working in one sector, a sector that is not enough or lucrative enough to actually support everyone, that is a big worry for any country, as it was back then for India. If you look at the manufacturing sector, back then, less than 10% workforce was actually in manufacturing. Industrial activities were mainly in handicrafts. That too started to decline when the British started to intervene. Handicrafts, they declined. Modern small industries came up, but not much. It was mainly done by hand, nothing with the help of machines. Modern industries such as jute, iron, steel, they did exist. The example of Tesco that we took, but they were very few and far in between. There were only a handful of these industries. The problem is that, see, even today, in India's context, why is it that the government wants to focus so much on manufacturing? Why is it that the government wants manufacturing to take the lead in India's economic progress? The reason is that manufacturing is the one that has the potential to employ as many people as possible, or employ much more people than services or agriculture. In manufacturing also, within that, it is these big plants like the steel plant, power plant, automobile manufacturing, garment parks. These are the ones that have the potential of engaging thousands of people at once. This is where we are lagging. We were lagging earlier. This is where we are lagging even today. And that's where I showed you the number earlier, that despite the best of efforts from the government, if you look at the contribution that manufacturing has for overall GDP, that does not seem to be going on a path up. Rather, it seems to be on a declining path. There were regional variations as well. Most of these economic activities are focused in a handful of areas. Bombay, Madras, Bengal, the three main presidency towns, were the ones that were the focus of any kind of industries. Although they also had certain decline, but again, any industry was mainly focused here. In terms of agriculture, a lot of focus was in Odisha, Rajasthan, and Punjab. They had a lot of focus on agriculture because they did not have any other employment opportunity. So it's very similar to the situation that we have even today. Some states, like Punjab, Haryana, focus much more on agriculture because of the availability of irrigation facilities, availability of fertile land, while some of the other parts of the country focus much more on manufacturing in other parts. This is the situation that we had back then as well. The colonial policies, as we discussed earlier, taking out the raw material, sending it outwards, not making any policies that are encouraging enough for the industries, all of that led to suppression of industries and suppression of employment opportunities in the country. The destruction of handicraft, as we said, was again something that led to migration. Why? See, the artists that were engaged in that were engaged in handicrafts, when they know that their stuff is not being sold anywhere, what will they do? They'll obviously migrate to a low skill job, that is agriculture. This is where agriculture was overburdened. And it's a similar case today as well. In the COVID-19 crisis, when a lot of people who were in the city lost their jobs, what did they do? They all, in large numbers, moved to the rural areas and they all got employed in agriculture. Did that mean that agriculture production increased all of a sudden? Not really. Agriculture production was similar as it was earlier as well. That again proves the fact that we were discussing earlier, that we have a situation of disguised unemployment. That many more people were engaged in agriculture, but that did not actually result in a bump in agricultural output. And the same was the case here. That while artists that could use their craft earlier were now moving to agriculture, they could not see any appropriate result or any appropriate bump in the agricultural output overall. What about the infrastructure? Where did we stand in terms of infrastructure at the time of our independence? Now, the British did focus on some aspects of infrastructure, although very clearly it was from their point of view and not from Indians' point of view. They focus on transportation, they focus on communication, again for themselves, so that their troops could move better. They could communicate with themselves better. They could send and make stuff better. They could make sure that against any mutiny in the country, they are always ready. So it was all about production for themselves. Railways, for example, was a prime focus of the British. And as I said earlier, many people still say that we should be thankful for the amount of railway infrastructure the British had built for us. The first passenger train in India, as you would all have read, was between Bombay and Thane in 1853. By the time that the British left India, India had a huge railway infrastructure, about fourth largest railway network in the world, around 50,000 kilometers of track. Now, when you say or when you criticize the governments after that, that despite that we have not been able to grow railway track at such a fast pace, please understand, it is not just about growing or increasing railway tracks. It is also about making sure railway tracks are refurbished and they are upgraded. When you introduce faster train, when you say now we have a train that will run at 200 kilometers per hour, you have to have tracks that will be able to sustain those trains. So it's a lot about refurbishing and upgrading those tracks as well. This is what the governments have been focusing on. The idea of the British introducing the railways was not about doing something well for India intentionally. It was mainly to enable easy movement of their troops, easy movement of their manufactured goods, etc. They had a limited positive impact on India's economic development, but were extremely important for the British so that they could extract our raw material out of the country as quickly, as easily as possible. One very interesting aspect of railways is, Mahatma Gandhi was a big critique of railway system. And it's very funny to understand. See, one of the reasons for Gandhi's popularity in India was that wherever he had those speeches, there were thousands and lakhs of people who would travel to his speeches. How? Trains. It is said that if the trains would not have been there, if we did not have the railways, Gandhi's popularity would not be that high. He would not have so much crowd actually coming to listen to Gandhi. But with all of that in place, Gandhi still was a big critic of railways. Why? He talked about economic exploitation. He said that because of the railways, we have seen our wealth being extracted, we have seen our local economy actually going down because the British are using this or misusing this to extract Indian products and taking it outside. He also talked about social disruption. It's a very interesting point of view. Understand this. It's a very unique thing to notice. If you look at some of the most pious and well known religious places of any religion around the world, look at the religious places, you would notice something that most of the religious places are at places which are far away from the common population, not very easy to reach. Now, these places are difficult to reach. That meant that only the people who really cared about religion, who really believed in them, would go to these places. But now, as per Gandhi, with the advent of railways, anyone can go and reach these places. So their value, their culture has actually degraded or deteriorated. We have seen a degradation in the value that these places hold, where once these places were actually those which were extremely pious, people would not really go there unless they were really needy, unless they really believed in it. Now anyone can go, and you can see it today. A lot of people go to religious places to make reels, to take selfies, not because they believe in that area or they believe in that power. That is what the Gandhian way of thinking was. Gandhi also was one of the few people who, at that time, over 100 years ago, was talking about environmental impact. Things that have become cool now to talk about climate change, etc. Gandhi was talking about that over 100 years back. Cutting down of trees, deforestation, etc. for the railways, displacement of animals because the tracks would go through jungles. All these are problems that he saw that railways brought to India. Unfortunately, no one noticed or no one paid attention, but he knew these are the problems that they had. In terms of roads, the British did build some roads, specifically the ones that mattered to them, but more of their focus was on railways. Roads were primarily built, as I said, for the movement of military troops and the ones that could just connect the railway station and the ports. Because for their point of view, any money spent by the British on India or India's infrastructure was only justified if it helped them in the long run. Any investment that they could make was only justified if it helped them earn more money. Thus, there were hardly any all-weather roads built. There were hardly any rural roads built. Living condition of the people was again as bad as you can imagine. The focus was much more on railways. Thus, it made much more commercial sense than the railways. Ports, again, it helped them for bringing in troops, taking the troops out, taking out raw material, etc., bringing fresh products into India. So there were some major ports developed. Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai were the major ports that were developed, especially to export raw material. They were again specially for the British. It's not that others were not allowed to access it. Like, for example, if Mahatma Gandhi went to the round table conference, he would go by what he would go by water, right? So he would take a ship. So it's not that the ports were not accessible to others, it was accessible to others, but mainly infrastructure, etc., that was built was mainly to serve the British and not any other interest at that point of time. There was some other very basic infrastructure built by the British, but again, especially for themselves. Limited development of inland waterways, so rivers, etc., were never developed for transportation purposes. There were some canals built, like in Odisha is a famous example of the coast canal that was built, but it was again done for the British trade specifically, nothing for the Indian interest. We also had a situation where there was no maintenance of these. Even when they were built, there was hardly any money that was being spent, hardly any budget given to them for their development or for their maintenance in the long run. The other aspect was telegraphs and postal services, something that British did focus on, especially again for themselves. Because they were a foreign power that had to send a lot of messages abroad, and messages had to be taken brought in within the country. Also, they had to mobilize their armed forces. They had to focus on these. In fact, it is said that one of the reasons for the success of British in the 1857 mutiny was the telegraph lines and the fact that they were able to communicate with each other while the others, that is the forces of India, could not. That is what led to their success. This is why the British understood the importance of these infrastructure such as the telegraph, the postal services, and they made sure that they invested money here specifically on the regions that suited them. The postal system did serve the public. In fact, postal system still exists. In fact, after India's independence, when the banking system did not reach the rural areas, post offices played an important role in financial inclusion as well. So there's no denying the fact that postal network, etc., did help the Indians as well. But again, that was never the true intention of the British. That is to help Indians in getting connected to each other. In terms of irrigation, again, very, very limited steps were taken. It was primarily to grow crops that British wanted to sell later. Cotton, indigo, which had a lot of value for British outside India, only irrigation to those fields was the focus of the British. There was little attention given to anything else that would help the Indian population sustain in the times of famine. In fact, the British did not even make any infrastructure to control floods or to have a better system for drainage. Anything that could improve agriculture productivity was never the focus until it led to improvement in the production of indigo, cash crops such as jute, etc. That is what mattered to them at the end of the day. Anything else that would not really have a positive impact on them was never at the forefront of what the British wanted to do with Indian irrigation or Indian agriculture infrastructure. Now, apart from all of these, the factors that we discussed, different industries, different sectors that we had, there were some other economic challenges that India faced at the time of our independence that have been detailed in this first chapter. For example, biggest one, as we discussed earlier, the lack of agriculture productivity. Hardly any investment being made in agriculture, hardly any new technology coming up. On top of that, forcing the farmers to grow something that you want against their own wishes, all of that was a perfect recipe for disaster. Almost no industrial base, zero foreign trade, almost all the trade done specifically from the point of view of the British, raw materials going from India to Britain, finished products coming back to India at a higher cost, no infrastructure for public uh, development, no infrastructure for human development. On top of all of that, and the result of all of that, obviously, was massive poverty and unemployment. That is where British had left India. And this is where chapter number 1 leaves us. To conclude, the British had almost zero positive impact on us in close to 300 years that they ruled over India. Yes, there may be some unintentional good things in terms of infrastructure. You can say we did inherit a lot of railway infrastructure, other kinds of infrastructure. But remember, none of them was built keeping India's own good in its forefront. This brings us to the end of the first chapter. Do join in for the second chapter where we take a journey forward for class 11th Economics NCERT. My name is Harshmeet Singh. Thank you so much.